Today's market action certainly is disappointing, particularly in light of yesterday's drubbing, and also particularly in light of the fact that Boeing and Apple, both bellwethers, had very strong numbers. And what's interesting here is investors came into the year 2015 with two overarching beliefs. One was that the U.S. was the best house in a bad neighborhood, and that the other is there simply is no alternative to U.S. stocks. And it turns out those two beliefs are what are getting investors into trouble. There are, in fact, alternatives to U.S. stocks, and we're seeing those alternatives lead the U.S. markets this year, whether it's gold, emerging markets, even foreign developed markets, and the debt markets. So I think investors are looking at earnings with a lot of skepticism and seeing currency becoming an excuse for lack of execution for companies yesterday like Procter & Gamble, Caterpillar, Microsoft, and a whole host of others.
Yeah, that was tough for the market to swallow, Larry. Cat's CEO calling the U.S. economic environment fragile. Would you go that far to say that the U.S. is fragile? What do you think the Fed will say about it this afternoon?
Clearly, there is a demand issue and there is an execution issue. And again, companies are hiding behind this currency excuse to cover up the fact that they're not executing. I mean, we see Boeing and Apple with the ability to execute, and they are export-driven companies, yet those other companies fail to navigate the same waters. So that tells us it's who's at the helm, what's the product, and what's the strategy that's going to drive investors. And for that reason, investors, if we look at where flows are this year, for example, value is still very strong for investors, and that's probably a mistake. If we look at utilities as an example, in a yield-driven world, it's really a question of when the Fed acts, not if the Fed acts. And very interest rate sensitive areas like that will likely suffer, whereas growth areas have been shunned by investors, and perhaps that's where they should be looking, where they can outgrow the challenges from the Fed.
But Larry, how many more apples do you think we're going to get? Because if you look at why Apple was successful, it wasn't anything that they did, I would argue, so much in the quarter. It's everything that they did in the quarters before, the design of the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, Apple's penetration into China, all the software. I mean, clearly all of that mattered. Any other companies really have that, or is Apple just a standalone exemplary player in today's business?
Well, I think it speaks to this idea of growth versus value in the marketplace. And by the way, in terms of opportunities, it's domestic versus international as well. And Apple is clearly driving international growth. They are executing that, but they're not alone. There are other companies. I mean, Boeing is an export-driven company that is generating a lot of growth from overseas. So in a growth-challenged world, low energy prices create a lot of opportunities for consumers in places like South Korea and India. It's the companies that seize those opportunities that will execute and be rewarded in this market. I mean, the biotech space has been largely immune from some of these currency issues. Those companies have executed, and they've been rewarded in the marketplace. So I think investors need to stop focusing so much on this sort of value versus growth, look for companies that are executing, and penalize those that don't execute. I think that's fair game in this market, and not let corporate management hide behind the fact that currency is this excuse. I mean, a strong dollar is good for the U.S. consumer, which should drive growth in a lot of these companies domestically.
Larry, that's as good a note as any to end it on. We appreciate your time this morning.